let's begin with your reaction to what's happened overnight.
Well, I think we can allow ourselves a partial sigh of relief. This seems to me to have been quite a restrained response. We'd heard earlier the possibilities of strikes against nuclear facilities or oil and gas facilities, which would have led to a spike in world oil prices. That hasn't happened, and that may be partly because of American pressure on Israel to be restrained. And I think that the message that Israel is sending here is we have now struck the missile manufacturing facilities, produced the missiles you fired at us. They've tried to avoid, I think, civilian casualties. They've allowed Iran to say to its own public opinion, not much damage was done, and to decide to draw a line under this dangerous tit-for-tat escalation. But I think this was at the lower end of the escalation ladder of the kind that we had seen as possible.
So you think it was the least worst option then?
I think it was the least that Netanyahu felt he could do while showing that Israel is strong and trying to re-establish deterrence over Iran, prevent further Iranian attacks. If you remember in April, when Iran fired a salvo of missiles at Israel, the Israelis waited and then they responded quite surgically to a number of sites, and the Iranians left it at that. And I think that that's what Israel will be hoping happens this time. It's certainly what America has been pressing to achieve. Israel doesn't need another battle right now. As you've been reporting, what's happening in Gaza, catastrophic humanitarian situation, the Lebanon war continuing. I don't think Israel is looking for further exchanges with Iran.
Peter, does it also show that Israel is listening more to the US now than perhaps it was previously?
Well, I think on the specific case of attacking Iran, yes. Israel knows very well that if this continues, if we go further up the escalatory ladder, Israel will really need American support in responding to further Iranian missile attacks. So I think they can't afford to ignore what has been very obvious and public pressure from President Biden downwards on the Israelis not to attack targets, either which would have led to the risk of nuclear damage or something which would have sent a huge spike into the world energy markets just days before the US election. So yes, I think they've heard that message.
Yes, there was talk of, well, as you say, lots of things that the Israelis could have targeted. And if they had have gone after the oil infrastructure, which of course funds so much of what Iran does, that would have had very wide ramifications, well, for all of us.
Yes, it would. And on the eve of the American election, Joe Biden certainly didn't want that. It would have been seen, I think, as a deliberate intervention by Israel, perhaps to try to swing the American election. That's dangerous for Netanyahu. And if they'd attacked the oil and gas facilities, who knows what the Iranian response would then have been. Saudi Arabia is not very far away, and it's already been shown by attacks from Houthis and others that the Saudi oil installations are vulnerable. So this then would have been a very dangerous escalation into something which would have had impacts on all of us with spikes in inflation and oil prices.
Do you expect the tit-for-tat response to continue now, or was this a measured enough response from Israel that means Iran don't necessarily have to reply in some way?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. I think nobody can reply to that now. That was clearly Israel's intention, to do this in a way which allowed the Iranians then to draw a line under it. We simply don't know whether the Iranians will do that. I think from Israel's point of view, they've got to be conscious of world pressure on them over Gaza, the terrible humanitarian crisis there. There are signs that Israel is beginning to think about how to wind it down in Lebanon. They've been talking about a larger UN presence after the withdrawal of Israeli forces. So there's plenty on the agenda that means Israel is not looking to take this further. The ball is now in the Iranian court. That's the problem with these tit-for-tat escalatory strikes. You never know what the opponent will say. The Israelis may feel that they've done enough now. Do the Iranians feel that they can let this pass, or will they have to conduct some further retaliation? We simply don't know, but it could take the path it took last April, with Iran deciding to draw a line under it and concentrate on support for their beleaguered allies, Hamas and Hezbollah. I mean, we shall have to see. I can't really call it any more than that.
No, look, I appreciate it's difficult to predict, but nevertheless, I'm going to ask you anyway, Peter, if you don't mind me saying.
Sure,
look, clearly
go
there's
ahead.
been a lot of focus in recent days on the north of Gaza, around Jabalia, and the terrible situation there, not least with a lack of much-needed aid. As you've alluded to, things may be winding down from an Israeli perspective in Lebanon, and then this being a measured response to Iran. With that all in mind, do you get a sense that we're reaching this turning point now towards, well, perhaps an end game?
Well, we've long hoped for and looked for that, haven't we? I think there's a sense perhaps that Israel can't continue at this intensity on all fronts. And I think, therefore, in Lebanon, they may feel they've done enough damage to Hezbollah south of that Litani River to begin to look at ways of extricating their forces. In Gaza, they've been fighting intensive bombardment for more than a year now, massive humanitarian consequences. They did say at an earlier stage that they had more or less cleared Hamas fighters from the north of Gaza. Now they've had to go back in, attacking hospitals, causing enormous further casualties. And there's an outcry around the world about the humanitarian cost of that. How long can this go on? I don't think that Netanyahu is now looking for a negotiated ceasefire with Hamas. I think he feels that after the killing of their military leader, Sinwar, they are effectively no longer a constituted fighting force, and that it is up to Israel to impose the settlement it wants, terms of demanding Hamas cease fighting, release hostages. I don't myself think that a negotiated ceasefire is an option, but perhaps the Israelis will conclude in the next few weeks that they have done enough to damage Hamas that they can begin to scale back the military operation while retaining the right to go back in and strike again if further threats arrive. I think the idea of a kind of formal negotiation, handshake with Hamas over a ceasefire, I think Israel has moved on from that.